I didn't see why it would be impossible for God to pick two of some large population of interbreeding organisms and infuse rational souls into those two. Those two commit the original sin, which is inherited by their descendants. If they interbreed with the larger population from which they're selected, then you have then you'll have eventually entire population who are descended from them. If God gives all their descendants rational souls, you have an entire population that's biologically descended from the larger population, but is genealogically descended from precisely those two.
Hi, welcome to the Catholic Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Keebler, and on today's episode, we are honored to have as a guest Dr. Kenneth Kemp. He's an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He got his PhD from Notre Dame in philosophy in 1984. He spent 8 years of active duty in the Air Force. And then he's taught at the U.S. Air Force Academy, Texas A&M, and for most of his career at University of St. Thomas. He's got a lot of varied interests, particularly in the history and philosophy of science, and with a sort of particular focus on how science and religion interact. And in that field, he's got a number of very interesting articles on the question of Adam and Eve and their origin and their relationship to other hominid species. And he's the author of two books. The first, The War That Never Was, Evolution and Christian Theology, which came out in 2020. And then his latest book that out on Catholic University America Press, The Origins of Catholic Evolutionism, 1831 to 1950. And it was published this year. So, Ken, great to have you on the show.
Oh, well, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so just get started, sort of introduce yourself to our listeners. So you have PhD in philosophy, a professor of philosophy. What got you interested in that field, and then maybe what got you interested after that into science and philosophy?
Oh, that's so long ago. It's hard to say, but maybe I should just start by saying I think I always had intellectual interests, and they had focus a little bit more in one direction, a little bit more in the other, but kind of big questions in intellectual history were, in the end, most attractive. So relation between philosophy, theology, and science. So that, in general, evolution and creation are big ideas, of course, and so they attracted me not least. Well, partly because each is a big idea of its own, partly because they are not only, you might say, not only connected concretely to one another, but are an instance of the connection between science and theology and philosophy. So that, I suppose, is what drew me to.
Yeah. There's a lot of really interesting questions, big questions at that interface of human origins. And there's philosophical, theological, and scientific questions. Yes. So it's a very rich sort of area for exploration.
Yes, I do appreciate all the very particular things that scientists have to study to make this possible. But yeah, there was big questions themselves that attracted me.
Yeah. So maybe just briefly before we jump into sort of talking about some other things, what you just give a brief overview of the book that you just published from CUA Press, just sort of what that entails, and what was the for our listeners, what's the rationale behind it?
Well, I suppose I should begin the answer by noting that there is and has for a long time been the idea that the way to characterize the relation between science and religion as conflict or even warfare. I mean, that's not a new idea. It's been kicking around since the end of the 19th century, but it still seems to be prominent enough that responses seemed appropriate. And I did address this a little bit philosophically, especially in the first chapter of my earlier book, The War That Never Was. But it's not just a philosophical question, but an historical question too. And so I thought that to answer the historical question, one needs to do case studies. And there have been some case studies focused on evolution creation, to be sure. I wanted to do it my own way, and I did that in The War That Never Was. But as I did that with its focus on, you might say, the more general controversies in our culture, the ones over creation science, the ones over intelligent design theory, the Scopes trial before that, I noticed that to take up the question of Catholic aspect of the relation between evolution and creation seemed to be a kind of a different story. So I mostly left it out of the earlier book, The War That Never Was, and decided to do a book just on the Catholic reception of evolutionary biology, or as I called it in the title, the Origins of Catholic Evolutionism.
Yeah.
So that's what the book in general, what I was trying to do.
Yeah, and so you had access to sort of the Vatican archives at this time. So what access did you have, and what are the Vatican archives?
Yes, I think you're asking a draft of the question whether this isn't kind of like Indiana Jones or something that. Yeah. But it isn't really. I mean, it's fun to pretend that when you're telling your friends where you're going and so on. But when you think secret archives, don't think, oh, that's kind of like secret agent, isn't it? Think it's kind of like Secretary of Agriculture. It's the kind of inner workings of the bureaucracy. You might say the private papers as opposed to public papers like encyclicals and so on. So draft of documents, discussions of documents, notes on committee meetings, stuff like that. They are, in the past, have been, for recent documents, still are not generally available for relatively ordinary reasons. I mean, they do deal with some cases of crimes and discipline, that is, canonical crimes and discipline. And they keep some of those private because they don't want to damage the reputation of people who are judged innocent. For one, with regard to books, they wanted to hear from people, this in the past, people who were concerned that a certain book might be problematically unorthodox, but they wanted people to be free to write that. If they decided the book was not problematic, they didn't want it public that it was criticized and so on. So there are relatively ordinary reasons why the access is limited. It had long been closed altogether. Leo the 13th, already at the end of the 19th century, began opening in limited ways some aspects of what were long called the secret archives. It's now called apostolic archives. And then about 25, 30 years ago, they began opening them up in a more comprehensive way. Everything through the pontificate of Leo the 13th, then the next pontificate, then the next pontificate, and finally, as I was more or less winding my research down, Pope Francis announced that he would open the archives through the pontificate of Pius XII. That was important for me because of Humani Generis.
Yeah, so that's one of the Humani Generis is the first papal document, papal encyclical that mentions the scientific theory of evolution, in roughly almost a century after Darwin, and so it's always sort of a landmark document people point to when they talk about the church's sort of views and statements on evolution. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about why is Humani Generis so important to the question of evolution from a Catholic perspective? What did it do, and in your mind?
Okay, we should begin, I suppose, by noticing that, though you're right to say it's important to the discussion, the Catholic discussion of evolution, one shouldn't think that that's the primary aim or primary subject of the encyclical itself. It's got a subtitle. Let me read it here so I can say it just the way it is. Some false opinions which threaten to undermine Catholic doctrine. Indeed, in the booklet, where it used to be where we all read these things before the before the world
for the internet.
Stole it all from us. This is listed as you can see as the title, and Humani Generis in small print beneath it. But of course, it's so much more convenient to call it Humani Generis, and that's a fairly standard way to refer to encyclicals. So that's what everybody does. But you shouldn't forget that the title, Some False Opinions, is more general. It's not just a response to evolution. It's a response to some new tendencies in theology in France and some new broader tendencies that you might call outside the church. I mean, the line outside the church, inside the church is, as you might imagine, sometimes a little difficult to draw, but it's also discussion of existentialism, to some extent of communism, to some extent of what you might call evolutionism where the term is something much broader than merely biological evolution, but some kind of comprehensive, not just comprehensive string of theories, but kind of comprehensive account of the origin of all things and so on, in a way that is sometimes, and this of course problematic versions, becomes materialist or pantheist. So it's an attempt to respond to all of those things. It mentions that general kind of evolutionism briefly. I don't want to be harsh by saying vaguely, but I mean, it's not, it doesn't, name names and so on. So the author of class might say, don't say vaguely, say generally. So, I mean, there's a kind of general concern about a certain kind of approach to philosophy of nature, you might say theology of nature, that's pantheistic rather than theistic in a way acceptable to Christianity. Then, very late in the encyclical, it turns to more particularly scientific issues in the broad sense of that word science. So it takes up evolutionary biology. It also talks up about history so science in the sense of natural knowledge.
Okay.
There he spends a couple of paragraphs on evolution, and they're important not because they're at the center of the encyclical. That doesn't really matter. I mean, what's important is what they say, not their, how they fit into some larger document. And there, as you say, he addressed the question of evolution. Well, I said the first time, surely the first time at this level of authority.
Yeah, and so the main thing that Pope said about it was that I think the leading scholars can investigate the origin of the human body insofar as it comes from pre-existing and living matter. So it gave sort of the ability of Catholics to hold that and to explore that. And it also talked a little bit about Adam and Eve, polygenism and monogenism. We can get into that in a little bit. But what did your research uncover about that document, particularly as it pertains to evolution, about what it did say and what it didn't say?
A couple of things. I mean, first one, should I note for for what it's worth, one thing it didn't say, in the sense of didn't bring up at all, that was the evolutionary origin of plants and animals.
Yeah.
That's not even raised as an issue. I think the only reason, would be because they didn't think it was problematic.
Yeah.
So that, is worth noticing, because there are still people out there that somehow think that if you're a Catholic, you shouldn't believe in the evolution of squirrels, stuff like that. So anyway, at least the large scale evolution of squirrels.
Right.
But so that's not even in there at all. What I suppose what surprised me most was that although the document is cautious about evolutionary origin of the human body, we should be careful about this, because if we say evolution of the human being, then it's you only get a human being when you got a body and a soul, and he's very explicit that the soul was created by God, and so you can't get an evolution, you can't get any human being from evolution alone. The most you could get is a human body. The document is remarkably cautious in the sense that it doesn't even say, well, we permit this. It says we do not forbid this.
Right.
And that was a very explicit choice of Pope Pius to put not forbid instead of permit, and so on. And he talks about the importance of recognizing arguments on each side and so on. But what surprised me was there was no discussion of this. The wording drifted back and forth a little bit in the way, not back and forth, drifted a little bit in the way that I mentioned, but I expected to see some discussion of this in the notes of the committee meetings as it went through, one draft after another. Those notes are not super detailed, but they do indicate discussion, particularly on polygenism and how exactly that issue should be characterized and so on. But the comments on evolutionary origin of the human body did not seem to be of sufficient concern to be worth being discussed. It just went through. So
none of the people seem to be arguing, oh, we shouldn't put this in there, that's too strong of a language. There just seems to be general agreement that, hey, that's a possibility. We can investigate.
Yes, that's right. Now, you could offer all kinds of explanations. Maybe they only had limited time and they thought other things were more important and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But still, if it was important, if it was deeply problematic, you would expect more. I was surprised to find no discussion of that. Discussion focused on exactly how to characterize the question of polygenism. That is, this is exactly how to characterize it. That is, there weren't big defenders of polygenism, but
why don't you just maybe at this point, since we brought that term up, explain what that is and what the document says about that.
Okay.
Maybe.
So a couple things. So first, what is polygenism and what's the problem with it? And then I suppose how authoritative is the statement. So what it is it's the idea that maybe it's easiest to describe it as a rejection of monogenism, whereas monogenism says there's one couple that are the first human beings, I would say fully human beings. The Latin says first true human beings. So one couple is the first true human beings, and all other human beings are descended from them. So that's monogenism. It's been for a long time the doctrine of the church, and it's closely tied to the doctrine of original sin, because if you understand original sin as Trent characterized it, namely one act and guilt for that act transmitted by propagation, not by imitation, and inherited by all other true human beings, then it's hard to see how that could be true without monogenism. Polygenism, by contrast, the idea that there were many first human beings. And so even if eventually everybody's descended from the whole group, maybe eventually everybody has descended from every individual in the initial group. Nevertheless, the first human beings weren't two, they were a whole group. And so either they were true human beings not guilty of original sin, which contradicts one of the points of Trent, or they all committed it, in which case the sin isn't one. Nevertheless, the general principles of Darwinian biology, even if they don't entail, nevertheless, in a weaker but nevertheless serious sense, are polygenistic, not just about human species, but about every species. Species originate not with some original couple marching off on its own, but of a whole community gradually developing so much that at the end of it, you got a new species. So that was to some extent reinforced when by genetic evidence, genetic variability within human beings, but in particular, a variability that matches a variability that we find in chimpanzees. It's too large to have that is like, but really the common elements in human beings and chimpanzees must have come from a common ancestor, and they could of human beings and chimpanzees. And there's too much variability in human beings to have come through a single couple. A single couple can't carry that many variants. So that kind of genetic evidence reinforces, in the minds of some people, polygenistic preferences. That's an odd way to put it. But implications, better to say, of Darwinism.
Yeah. If you look at the gene pool of modern humans, the genetic variability, the amount of linkage that you see between different alleles, it's you can do models if we know how frequent mutations occur and so forth. That it's clear that the sort of the humans could not have passed through a gene pool of two people, right? And it's got to be a bigger gene pool that contributes to modern humans, on the order of a couple thousand probably, at least. And so that's sort of the biological evidence, like you're talking about, for polygenism. But then then the concern is, how does that fit with the sort of original sin and this idea that you have a first couple, right? And so they caution against polygenism in the document.
It's not absolute. Let me read the words so that we stay as close as possible to the text. Oh, I typed out too many pages of notes here. Where did I put those? They're in bold in the page.
It's always good to go back to the text. So that's always get that quote right.
Where did it go? So, okay, it is in no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled. So I should have those things memorized. I talk about them enough. But it's no way apparent how. He could have said something stronger. Stronger versions were proposed to him by the committee that prepared a draft, and the final decision was made by Pius himself between that and other versions that were proposed. So people have long argued, this shows it's not absolute. So my archival research reinforces that idea. Indeed, a few years later, that is a few years after the encyclical, in 1955, some of the same committee that were then still at the Holy Office said to Pope Pius, look, people are saying that it's no way apparent that isn't absolute. Shouldn't we tighten this up? And Pius said, no, I like it the way it is. So, I mean, we need to concede that. Nevertheless, to eager polygynists, that's a funny way to put it. People that are that think that polygynism is in right, they point to that and say, see, it's not absolute. But I think that one has to say, look, it says it's no way apparent how it can be reconciled with, and then he specifies what. And some of them make some effort to meet those criteria. I don't think they ever succeed. So I think that it's fair to say, I mean, to point to the exact wording, but but he does set criteria. I mean, people say, well, maybe the one act was one act of the whole community. All these thousands of cavemen, or however many there were, got together and committed one act. And you say, first, what was this, a flash mob or something? Did they have cell phones? How could you get 1,000 people, all of them? I mean, and maybe probably 1,000 isn't enough. Probably there's maybe 10,000 is more accurate. So you get all these 10,000 people together in the valley, and Adam says, who wants to go into sin? And they all raise their hand. It is not very plausible. And second, you might say, and these the 10,000 cavemen didn't have any babies, or the babies raised their hand too. How could the babies have committed the sin? And so they say, I mean, when I have to go through one by one all the ways of that people talk about this, maybe they'd say, that's not fair. You're caricaturing my view. And you say, well, how exactly? How exactly did 10,000 people commit one sin? How did the babies? Those seem to be serious questions. In my mind, they don't answer them.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that critique stands.
Related to that, I mean, what would you respond to someone said, well, there's 1,000 individuals and, an initial one sinned and then eventually all of them sinned in quick succession. And so therefore there was an original sin and initially it didn't spread through propagation, but very quickly the whole population had sinned. And now would that be problematic in relation to Trent, or do you think it's not?
I think it would. It's not propagation. Yeah. I mean, I think propagation means biological descent or something that's equivalent to it. And that what you said, everybody says, oh, that looks like fun. I guess I'll do it too.
Right.
Wish I'd thought of it first or something like that.
Yeah.
That's imitation, and that's what's explicitly ruled out. So
at Trent, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, it seems to me that the I'll put it as generously as I can. The strong suspicion against polygynism stands.
Yeah.
I mean, as generously in the sense of as being open to that phrase as possible.
Yeah, and so you've got a couple articles that try to sort of reconcile this, what seems to be an irreconcilable notion, the idea that, hey, biologically, it seems like we've got to have a bigger gene pool. Theologically, it seems to point, and I'm not going to say it definitely points, but it does seem to point that there was an initial couple, one sin that then propagates. So so you've contributed sort of a possible model to this. So maybe if you could sort of explain what that contribution is, and then we can sort of pick it apart a little bit.
Yeah, the idea is that the biological and the biologists who look at this are looking at the body, are looking at the genes, and so on. But the theologians are looking not at the body, but not at the body alone anyway, but the question of whether we've got a rational animal here. And I didn't see why it would be impossible for God to pick two of some large population of interbreeding organisms and infuse rational souls into those two. Those two commit the original sin, which is inherited by their descendants. if they interbreed with the larger population from which they're selected, then you'll have eventually entire population who are descended from them. If God gives all their descendants rational souls, you have an entire population that's biologically descended from the larger population, but is genealogically descended from precisely those two, such that those two are in the genealogy of everybody. And so that seemed to me to be scientifically plausible, theologically orthodox, and solve the problem.
Yeah. So in that second generation, you have these we'll call them sort of theological humans, true humans that have a soul, but they then start mating with non-theological humans, and so I think that's is that when you read criticisms of what you've put out, that seems to be the main criticism. Well, why would God set up this situation where you gotta have bestiality or mild form of bestiality to propagate the human race? And I don't weigh in on it, but I know, what's your response to that criticism?
People do say that, and there are several things I'd say in response. First, that degree of genetic variability that we find isn't necessary. That's not necessarily part of God's plan. Maybe he had a plan to expand the human race differently. I don't know. He didn't tell me, or didn't tell anybody. So it's not necessary. So it's not that's true. Second, it's not bestiality in the. I mean, in one sense it is, in one sense it isn't. Of course, the only kind of beasts we know are I don't know, barnyard animals and pets and stuff like that. And there really is awful. But the kind of thing we're talking about here is beings that look like us and are interfertile with us. And so it, maybe this is harsh to say too, but it's, I think, true. It's less like what goes on in this imaginary barnyard than it is like what goes on in some of our dormitory rooms. I mean, it's kind of impersonal sex. Whether it's worse or better, I don't know. In the one case, you're mistreating another human being. In the other case, it's in principle impersonal because the other being is not a person at all. So, I mean, it may not. I don't think it's that bad, but that doesn't mean it's not bad. If it was voluntary, it may not have been voluntary. It may have been involuntary, forced by the non-human. And they're not truly human beings. So we might say, first, it may not have been, it wasn't part of God's intent. Second, it wasn't necessarily even intentional, much less sinful. Third, even if it was sinful, it's no worse than lots of other things that people do. The people did. Go read Genesis again, read about the flood and stuff like that. I mean, these weren't a bunch of holy people.
Evil
ancestors
came into the world. Yeah, that's the one thing I at the beginning, after the fall, or after the evil quickly runs amok, and even if you look at Genesis, you have fratricide and immediately. And so even with that, the idea you would have to have some type of incest going on there to maintain, if they were just breeding amongst themselves to have that. And so it's pretty clear that there isn't a clean, neat. But reality wasn't clean and neat once sin enters the world. So
it wasn't. Oh, they wouldn't have done that. They might have killed their brothers, but they wouldn't have done that. So anyway, that's in general my response to that kind of objection. I mean, I suppose it's a good sign that one is so pious towards one's ancestors that one can imagine them doing that. But here we need not filial piety, but honesty.
Another objection. Another objection that I've seen, and it's more on the philosophical note, is that people argue, and you're making the case that you have all these sort of biological beings that are about the same, and two of them are chosen by God to be the first couple, have a rational being sold. And people argue, well, that seems voluntaristic. Why does he pick those two if they're the same physical being as others? And so maybe does there have to be a physical change in this, these first couples, such that they have certain physical difference that calls out, the type of body that's slightly distinct from these others, that calls for a human soul.
Yeah.
But they're still able to interbreed, just like we know humans and Neanderthals were able to interbreed, right? Is that necessary, do you think, or
I don't think so. I mean, it is a feature of the earlier version. I can't claim all the credit for this idea. Partly it comes from a priest named Andrew Alexander, who wrote a version of this some years before. It's cited in my first article, and he had genetics in the title because he thought there was a genetic difference. I don't so much insist that there wasn't as to say I don't see why it's necessary. And so I'll say first why I don't think this creates some problem of, well, what the critics call voluntarism. I'm not sure that that's the right term, but let's just say that means, for the sake of this discussion, it means that. Is it problematic? Well, look, I might start with saying, if you take a very literal interpretation of Genesis, God takes some slime of the earth and forms it into a human body. And does one say, well, why just that slime? There was other slime there that would have just been just as suitable. Why did he take this slime and not other slime? I said, well, that's all he needed. So that for one. Second, it seems clear in salvation history that God does pick sometimes one, even, or a few, even when there were a number of others that would have been equally suitable. Why did Naaman, the leper, get the cure? And not, were there no other lepers in Syria? Why did Zacchaeus get to have Jesus at dinner at his house? Why the 12 apostles? And the answer might be sometimes that was all he needed. He didn't have enough nights free on his schedule to go to every tax collector's house. He only needed 12 apostles. 12 is symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there are all kinds of reasons why he might pick two, even though there were many suitable candidates. And so I don't see it. In addition to that, I mean, the other people that didn't get chosen as apostle, Matthias or something like that, could at least say, why not me? But the animals that he didn't pick can't say, why didn't you make me into a human? Because in making him into a human, he would have replaced him. It wasn't that this animal becomes human because the substantial form is replaced. And so what's the animal going to say? Why didn't you eliminate me?
The animal wouldn't have that ability to even think that concept.
That's that too. Yes,
they would have been left out. They wouldn't even know what they were missing. Yeah.
Yes.
That's
so that's my reply to that. I know that objection is made, but
no, I know we've had discussions on that. You and I disagree a little bit on that, but I don't want to get into those right now. I want to just sort of focus on finish up here today talking a little bit about your book and what you found there. So you title it "The Origins of Catholic Evolutionism, 1831 to 1950." So maybe you could start. Just what is the term Catholic evolutionism? How do you?
Okay. Yeah, I suppose the first thing to say about it is that it's not something as narrow and precise as Euclidean geometry or Newtonian physics, where you say, look, here are the 3 laws, here are the 5 axioms. If you're doing geometry this way, then it's Euclidean. Otherwise, it's Riemannian, something different. But so I don't want to see it that way, because when I looked at people who were Catholics who were receptive to the new ideas of evolutionary biology, I found was a number of different spectra. That is, they could think this is to be taken seriously, it's possible, it's probable, it's well, in the weak sense that scientific ideas can be, it's certain, it's very solid. There are a number of different ideas here, a number of different versions of evolution. I mean, even apart from, well, let's focus on Darwin's two central ideas. That is, common ancestry and natural selection. Darwin himself says about natural selection, it's a primary, but not probably not exclusive
Right.
form of modification. So you could think primary but not exclusive, important but not exclusive, contributory but not primary. I mean, there's a whole range of ideas. Common ancestry of squirrels, of rodents, of mammals, of vertebrates, of animals. I mean, you could, take the common descent so far or farther. Even Darwin acknowledges that there's kind of a range of views that one might reasonably have. So across a number of spectra, there is variation. So one might say minimally some kind of transformism, somehow the idea that new species are the product of descent with modification from previously existing species, whether that's a common descent for very different species or not. People might vary over that, whether natural selection or some kind of inherent drive toward complexity. There are variations, but if it's not transformist, you might say, in what sense is it evolutionist? The Catholic evolutionism is at least restricted in this, that it's got to give, I think, some kind of exceptionalist account of human beings. The early account of evolution of the body and creation of the soul, or maybe partial evolution of the body supplemented by further divine modification or something. There's a lot of variation, but it seems maybe one say Catholic evolutionism should be transformist and exceptionalist. But there's a lot of variation within that. I suppose, third question, where is Pelagianism and monogenism sit? Does he have to be a monogynist to be a Catholic evolutionist? Well, I don't want to be, there's no point in my being super restrictive. I need to have some limits to the idea, and maybe this sits right at the margin. Maybe I should say, at a minimum, a Catholic evolutionist has to give some account of how his account of the evolutionary origin of the human race is compatible with the doctrine of original sin.
Yeah,
that's to be
good. Yeah,
very broad. But
yeah, no, it's interesting how many different sort of ideas about evolution there are, not only amongst Catholics but non-Catholics alike, particularly over the last 100.
Yes.
Since the time of Darwin, over the last 175 roughly years, and so you had, particularly in the 1800s, you had people with all kinds of different scientific theories. Some were Darwinian, some were partially Darwinian, some were different than Darwin's ideas. But they had some, like you said, some transformative aspects that species could transform one to the other. There was some natural mechanism that could do that. And so there's all kinds of those arguments going on in the scientific community. And did you see those same arguments? I mean, I guess for Catholics, that the bigger question, as you mentioned, was really the where do humans fit in all this? The origin of humans. How do humans emerge out of an evolutionary process? And you point out, well, at minimum, there's got to be some exceptionals. There's something else. Evolution can't explain the totality of man. But connecting humans to this evolutionary process, I think, was the biggest sticking point. And so, what did you? How did the the church, what are the reactions you have to evolutionary biology, particularly early on in the 1800s, and what did you find out in your research? Is there a general pattern there, or was it just all over the map? Would you say how would you describe that?
I suppose one might see three basic answers to the question of human origins. The one is that God formed the human body out of the slime of the earth, to use the old translation. I suppose dust of the earth is a politer, newer version. And maybe that's good, because would you want at Ash Wednesday to go up and say, the priest say, man, you're slime, and to slime you'll return. So maybe dust is nicer. But whatever it is, dust, slime, that's non-living matter. That was the one on the one extreme, you might say, that God formed by direct divine action on non-living matter, supplemented by infusion of a created soul. The infusion of a created soul is almost universal and only gets stronger. It is precisely created, as opposed to somehow coming from the parent soul or something like that, some kind of what's sometimes called traducianism. But so there's a general agreement on creation of the soul. Then the one extreme, you might say, formation of the body from non-living matter. The second, or the other extreme, you might say, is evolution of the body and infusion of the soul. That is, the body, the evolutionary processes bring about the body, and then it's supplemented by infusion. This is articulated already by St. George Mivart, a prominent English biologist, in 1871. So the same time that Darwin presents his explicit defense of evolutionary origin of the human race in his book, The Descent of Man. So that's, you might say, the other extreme. Is that evolution sufficiently accounted for the body into which the soul was infused? In the end of the 19th century, Spanish Dominican, one of the leading neo-Thomists of his day, also for many years primate of Spain, retired from his episcopal duties as primate and wrote a book on the Bible and science. And he argued that everything that the member just said about evolution of the body can be sufficiently accounted for by a partial evolution of the body, supplemented by further divine action. That is, and I mean, one could say that today. Nobody can say, look, I can show you exactly what mutations, created the human body, and where those mutations came from. What star or whatever created the cosmic rays that causes mutation? Nobody can say that. So can we say, well, we know from science that those last mutations were the product of natural processes and not divine action, that God didn't touch things up? Well, we can't say that even now. So many people, I suppose, to avoid needless quarrels, but I don't want to say they weren't serious about it, accepted this middle ground position. I mean, Gonzalez said, look, the scientists can't say they know every last change was a result of a natural process, and there are theological reasons for thinking that God acted directly. Maybe he acted directly on an animal body rather than on non-living matter, but Gonzalez thought there were theological reasons for direct action on the body. So you got those three positions. Even early on, some defenders of emeritus position argued basically on the basis of a theology of nature that was later called Christian naturalism, that God uses natural processes whenever he can. I mean, if the natural processes will do it, he uses them, and only when we can show either by reason that natural processes couldn't do it, or some revelation that unnatural, I mean, the God direct divine action was in stake. Then only then should we argue for this position that God touched up, modified the evolution.
What do you think was driving that position at the time? Was it more they didn't think there was a scientific ability to form the human body, or was it more theological? We have theological warrant to believe that there was a direct physical change that, like instead of physically changing the slime, he physically changed an organism. It was that more of the rationale for that hybrid, that middle ground position?
I think that was the first and primary one. I think that was Gonzalez. That's what he says anyway. There's the theological reasons for thinking that there's more direct divine action than Mivert acknowledges. Beyond that, I mean, when other people adopt more or less that position, they don't cite Mivert, or sorry, they don't cite Gonzalez as much as they should. Whether they didn't read him, I don't know. Maybe they didn't read Spanish. It was never translated. But anyway, another reason for adopting it might just be, if we can't prove it scientifically anyway, why get in a big fight about it? That is why, why emphasize this, since we can't really show that science did it? Why not be content with the idea that that evolutionary processes contributed to the origin of the body? I mean, this goes back to something we skipped over, but you asked why. I mean, why I didn't think that the body was different. The theologically human had a different body from the others. That seems to me that creates problems down the line. You might say, if it's, I mean, are you going to have first a mutation in both Adam and Eve, at the same place at the same time and exactly the same mutation? And if you only have one mutation in each of them, even if it's a dominant gene, you're going to have the risk of doubly recessives that don't have the hominization gene at all, and you're going to have to explain how that's driven out of the population. Now, all of that does, some of it's scientifically possible to say, strong heterozygous selection against heterozygous selection. In terms of the double mutation, so that you have less, you're going to have a problem with this anyway, the interbreeding. But with the double mutation, somebody says, God did that. That is, if God did those mutations, then what he did once, he could do twice. What he did twice, he could do 4 times. Or he could have done it twice in Adam and then done a kind of better genetic engineering to move that gene over to Eve. Now, so in either of those cases, you're falling back on direct divine intervention as opposed to natural processes. But if you think you really need that and you're willing to give up a stronger version of Christian naturalism to preserve it, well, I can't say it's impossible.
I mean, you can also argue that, some of their offspring weren't then fully human because they just didn't get, so you have a mix and so it does get messy, but you could save the naturalism and say, well, they had certain genetic changes and some of their offspring did, some didn't inherit it, so some were truly human, some weren't, and so
that you can do for a while, but you don't. But eventually, that non-hominized gene has to be driven out of the population. Even otherwise, I got a good explanation of why my neighbors are some rational.
Right. Yeah, and I think you can come up with scientific explanations how it would be driven out of the population over a few number of generations, but you still have this mix of this messiness going on where true humans are producing non-humans, so it is. But it's the interesting thing about all these scenarios at the origin of the human race. There's always some messiness there in all of these scenarios, and one of the things we're never really going to be able to prove one versus the other. They're all, as you said, they're hypothetical scenarios.
Yes, I mean, I'd like to see the alternative worked out in some detail. And I
Yeah.
should add, when I talked about my neighbors, I meant other people,
Right.
not my
Right.
real neighbors,
Exactly.
all of
Exactly.
whom are clearly rational, clearly disinterested.
Right. We don't need your neighbors calling in on this podcast. You know, so they're complaining
Yes.
about Ken. Ken doesn't like me. No, no. So we're getting here to the end, Ken. Maybe if just to finish up, you could just sort of summarize the conclusions you found in your book. I mean, this is a really big book. It's spanning lots and lots of years and trying to, give a sense of what the Catholic evolutionism, what was going on as people thought and wrestled about these ideas. But what would be your take-home message to
Okay, well, I
people?
tried to pull a few things out in the last chapter there. I tried to summarize it in terms of 7, but you say, no, boiling down your 500 pages to 7 is too many for the podcast. Can you put it down to 3? Something like that. So here's what I tried to pull out of that. So the theory of the evolutionary origin of plants and animals was quickly and generally judged to be theologically open question. Even by most of those who believed it was false, for scientific or philosophical reasons, they didn't think it was theologically problematic.
Okay.
The magisterium never condemned the theory of evolution, though it did prohibit some evolutionist and works and suppress some others. Maybe it shouldn't have, but I mean, it's history. They did occasionally do that. Finally, the heart of the Catholic controversy over evolution was over whether the formation of the first human body was the result of evolutionary processes. So that, you might say, in very brief summary, is the way I'd try to summarize it.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a great book. It's a fascinating read because there's so much going on and so many different things and people arguing different things, and it's interesting how how fruitful it was, the different ideas that were coming forth and being debated back and forth. But at the end of the book, you talk a little bit about Humani generis, and so I mean, I just think, why do you think we can end here? It took the church that long to actually mention the scientific theory of evolution in a papal document, roughly 100 years after, say, Darwin, and many years into the time where evolutionary theory was sort of fully accepted in some version. I mean, by the scientific community. So what's your take on that?
It's maybe a big and a complex question in one way. Another way, I might say it's hard to answer because, I mean, when you ask, why did something happen? And you come back and look for causes. Say, why did something not happen? Then it becomes more complicated. You can ask, was it proposed and rejected? Or was it just they never did it? And, well, I mean, I suppose one could acknowledge one place a proposal was made. Congregation of the Index reviewing one emeritus book wrote to the Holy Office and suggested that it would be good to have a statement on this. The Congregation of the Index had the authority to prohibit, or at least propose prohibiting a book, put it on the list of books Catholics weren't supposed to read, but they had no authority to issue doctrinal statements. And they didn't even say why a book would be should be prohibited if they thought it was. It just was put on the list. So they suggested that the Holy Office look into it. The Holy Office ignored the suggestion. They didn't discuss it and decide to reject it. So other than that, we can say it wasn't proposed and rejected. It didn't come up. Why not? Well, a number of different things perhaps played a role here. One, they weren't in the end of the 19th century completely past relitigating the whole Galileo controversy, and so the church still being scolded about Galileo might have been especially reluctant to enter quickly into a new scientific issue until they were clearer about things. So second, there were lots of other big issues that seemed more urgent. I mean, look at what's going on in Europe at the end of the 19th century on the question of church-state relations. In Germany, Kulturkampf. In Italy, Risorgimento. In France, well, laïcité, you can say, but maybe that's not as extreme as the kind of anti-clericalism that was going on at the time. I mean, look at the characters I was writing about. Wassmann, leading German Catholic evolutionist, was in exile in the Netherlands and Luxembourg because the Jesuits had been expelled from Germany. Teilhard de Chardin was finishing his preparation for the priesthood in England because
Okay.
the Jesuits been thrown out of France and so on. So all that anti-clericalism, that liberalism in the 19th century, special 19th century sense of that word, created a much bigger problem. On the other extreme, socialism. So on the general questions of Catholic social doctrine, the relation between capital and labor, there were the whole modernist issue, which some people try to tie to evolutionism. I argue in the book that modernism is really, its concerns are elsewhere. They're a different kind of concern about hermeneutics, a different concerns about ecclesiology and sacraments and so on. All these things had to be discussed, and the church probably thought of them as more important. Extremes they did cover. They didn't talk about evolution explicitly, but they were explicitly anti-materialist. So if you have materialist evolutionism, well, that's ruled out explicitly by other statements. Creation of the soul, that's fairly explicit elsewhere. So you might say some of the margins are already covered, and maybe they say, well, the exact question of the origin of the human body, we can wait a little there. And then there are things in France that are happening that where the Pope is urged by some French priests to address
It was
evolution.
pretty clearly a tumultuous time for the church-state relationships, and how many things were changing, and the concerns of sort of other modernist heresies, and like you said, the atheism and materialism and communism, and all these different thoughts that the church had to deal with. So, yeah, you can see that being a reason not to enter into this until much later. So. That's great. Well, Ken, it's great to sit down with you and to hear your thoughts on this, about your book, and just on Catholic interaction with evolution in general, and Humani Generis. We're coming up on the 75th anniversary of that this year, and so but I recommend your book to anybody that's interested in the history of how the church is engaged with evolution. It's Catholic University Press, The Origins of Catholic Evolutionism, 1831 to 1950. So, Ken, thanks for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Catholic Scientist Podcast, sponsored by the Society of Catholic Scientists. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. And you can also show your support by donating to the Society to help us produce content like you just heard. You can donate by going to our website at catholicscientist.org and clicking on the donate button. You can also find other useful resources, articles, and videos on our website.